the second in our series of TNP videocasts. My name is Hrishabh Sandilya, and my guest for today is Dr. Jagannath Panda from the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses in New Delhi. The IDSA is one of India's premier think tanks, and Dr. Panda is a China expert who focuses on China's role in international institutions and, of course, Sino-Indian relations. Today we're coming to you from the serene locales of the Anglo-American University Library in Malá and Prague. And Dr. Panda himself is in Prague today as a guest of the AMO, the Association for International Affairs, where he will be delivering a lecture on Sino-Indian relations during his stay. Dr. Panda, thank you for coming on and talking to us today at the New Presence. Let me start. You mentioned that you've been traveling around Europe for the last 3 months. Could you perhaps tell us more about what Western and European perceptions are of India and China today?
It's a very interesting question, actually. I've been traveling all over the Europe, be it in the Scandinavian countries, in the Eastern Europe or Western Europe. I got to know a different perspective on India and China. What I believe is that my understanding, my readings about the European dialogue on Asia, European dialogue on China and India, suggests that it's a very confused view here about India and China. Let me put it in specific details. First, I'll be talking about European views about China. The rise of China is always a big debate today in every part of the world, and in that context, the Europeans are also equally serious about the rise of China. But then they are yet to decide whether the rise of China debate is really a debate has to be taken in affirmative sense, or the rise of China has to be taken in a negative or in a security concern perspective. So in that context, I think the European dialogue on China, the rise of China, is equally confusing, and it's not really a very constructive dialogue.
And this would be different from the American dialogue?
I would say to some extent this is different from the American views on the rise of China. In America, what we, in the specific Western world, we do get a sense that they do see China as a rival always, and that's the dominant view in the American world. But in Europe, though the most part of the Europe, they do see that China is a strategic concern at some level, but they are a little bit hesitant to speak out the truth, or they are a little bit hesitant to speak their mind openly, because they do see China also as an equal opportunity. Partly because Europe as a unity, Europe as an entity is not primarily doing well, and they do see that integration in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms of strategic terms with China does give them some scope at the strategic level in the world politics.
Okay, and how would you sort of contrast this with the EU or European perceptions of India? Is it sort of less? Does Europe feel less threatened by their perceptions of India?
Of course, most part of the Europe, they do see India, so-called rise of India, more in terms of social and economic sense, rather than in more strategic sense. So they don't really necessarily see India's rise as a security concern, or a rise which will predominant, which is going to dominate the Western, the European or the Chinese world in that context. The rise of India is quite independent in that context, and they do say that India's rise should be read much more in socio-economic terms rather than in strategic terms. So they do see they have a different kind of parameters when they evaluate rise of China and rise of India.
So you're saying that, my question to you then would be, does the West actually have, or should the West have anything to fear from China or India, or is it sort of, are they going to arrive at some sort of equilibrium and work with each other in the next?
Of course, if we talk about the Western dialogue on China, it is always the same. They do see China as a security concern and security rivalry. But about India, I'm not sure. They do see that India has a lot of depth and scope to rise and make a presence in the world politics. But then, the Western, they try to reach to China and India in different scale, in different parameters. They don't really maintain the same standard. They do see China as a security concern and also as an opportunity. So there you will find a dual-mate strategy from the Western world. Whereas in India, they do see India as a strategic scope for the US presence or the Western presence in Asia.
Right.
So they try to reach India more in socio-political and economic sense rather than in strategic sense.
Right. Using the Indian diaspora, using connections. But all right, let's move to the next question. Can we actually even compare India and China today? What's the difference? What do you see as a ground for comparison or difference between these two Asian giants?
Having a realistic comparison is always a difficult entity on world politics, particularly if you are comparing between two different systems, like a system which is predominantly called a communist system or a successful communist system, and a system which is successful democratic system. But yes, there are different parameters to compare. For example, if we talk about specific in economic terms, I do see that China is far ahead of India in that context. And I do see that Chinese economy is primarily doing well. It has been doing well. And for the next 20 to 30 years, I do see that Chinese economy would be doing well and probably would emerge as the first largest, single largest economy in the world.
But definitely, is there, I mean, if you had to compare in terms of systems or ways of doing things, which, can we even ask, is there a method to ask if there's a better model? Is the Indian democratic, perhaps more inefficient way better, or is the Chinese authoritarian way better?
Yeah, that's the point I was making. Economy doesn't really sustain always the political system. So that's the primary dilemma in Chinese, hold in the rise of China.
So what you're saying is that as long as there's economic growth, there will be stability, that eventually the economic growth will sort of peter out, and there will be a chance that stability will start to be a major concern within China.
Yes, in that context, the rise of China is more dependent on the economic rise of China, and which is going to sustain the political economy. So in that sense, we can't really say whether it's a better system than India. In India, we have a stable political system, democratic system, and that's really sustaining the economics. So India has got a long say in world politics in comparison to China. So I do see that the scope of rise of India is much more a stable phenomena in comparison to the rise of China debate in world politics.
Okay, let's focus on the two giants themselves. Let's talk about India and China, the current strata of relations. They fought a war in 1962, which China won convincingly. India's border dispute with China, the Chinese non-acceptance of India's border, especially in Arunachal Pradesh and parts of Kashmir, is one of China's long-standing unsolved border demarcation disputes. What do you see as the sort of current state of relations between India and China? Are we supposed to believe the rumor-mongering or scaremongering, especially in the Indian press, about China, or are we just going to see a few more years of stability and economic cooperation before we see any major changes?
I must say that the 1962 war memory is not really readily available in Indian public memory today. They seems to be forgetting it. But then the 62 war cannot be forgotten because there are so many related adjacent issues related to it. For example, the issue of Tibet, the issue of a boundary dispute, or the Chinese claim on Arunachal Pradesh, and the Chinese military presence around India, particularly the Indian Ocean. So therefore, it's really difficult to say whether both the parties would like to forget the 1962 war straight away and come to a debate where they could have some cooperative agreement or cooperative fusion. But yes, I mean, if we see the Chinese behavior regarding this, I think China has to show some maturity when it comes to its relationship with India. In that context, I do see that the way Chinese are behaving on, the Chinese claim on Arunachal Pradesh, the Chinese radical posture on Tibet, these are problematic issues, and it will have some impact on China-Indian relations. So I don't really buy that argument that China and the relationship will be a cooperative kind of posture, and it is. We won't be seeing those problematic issues coming up again and again. I think China and India relations is one of the most sensitive issue, and it will be more sensitive with the in the coming years.
It's interesting you mentioned the Indian Ocean. China's under a massive reconstruction, sort of refitting of its navy to sort of ensure that it has a blue water capability, especially in the Indian Ocean, given that the Indian Ocean so far has always been the domain of the Indian Navy, perhaps the American fleet there. Is that another reason why India should sort of fear China, given what's happening in Gwadar in Pakistan, in Antambola and Sri Lanka, the fact that they're building ports in Burma, that India is losing strategic control of the Indian Ocean?
Yes, this is a very strategically, very significant question in the sense that at the moment, if you see those commercial ports the Chinese are building, they are necessarily, commercial ports. There is no dispute in that fact. Those are commercial ports and for commercial reasons, economic